about that in this letter as well. You're a new creation. You're a holy nation, a people belonging to God. This is who you are. This is what he's done in your life. And so you've spent enough time in that world. It's time to pursue Christ with all your heart. So those who've been shaped by the cross, it transforms also not only the way we look at suffering, the way we look at sin, but how we live together as a church. So the world may be coming to an end. I don't know. But even if it is, and especially if it is, if we're facing times of severe trials, how are we to live together as a church? And I'll tell you one of the things that we're not to do, we're not to isolate ourselves. This has been definitely a time of isolation socially. And it's always, for years and years, it's been a time of individualism. So we tend to focus on ourselves and our wants and our needs and desires. And it's kind of like every man, woman, and child for themselves. But Peter wants to remind us, and I want to remind us, that a big part of our witness in the world is how we live together. And so if we scatter when we're pressed, if we go into our bubble or our little cocoon when we're facing trials or temptations, our witness is lessened, it's tarnished. And so in this passage, in this little section, Peter gives 4 commands and one overarching goal for a community that's shaped by the gospel. So we're looking primarily at 7 to 11. And the first is this: be focused so you can pray. Be focused so you can pray. Or in the New Living Translation, it says, be earnest and disciplined in your prayers. I think it was Marx. I don't usually quote Karl Marx, but I think he talked about religion being the opiate of the people. So it sort of just takes away, makes you passive and just accepting. And someone else said, proper prayer, real prayer, is not an opiate or an escape, but rather a function of clear vision and seeking even clearer vision from God. I find myself, it's hard to focus these days. I can go off on so many tangents. I've been trying to develop, grow in a discipline of just being silent, not having to say anything, even in prayer, just being silent and listening. And it's really hard. I don't know, there's always something going on up here. Apparently that's not the case for everybody. I don't want to say it that way. But some people, I process everything up here. Some people process it as it comes out of their mouths. I know some people like that. But I have to process, I do a lot of it up here before anything comes out of my mouth. Sometimes it never does. But it's so distracting. There's so many things going on. It's really, really hard to focus. We're distracted. And I think sometimes in our culture, increasingly shallow. Some have said that our addiction to social media is just making us stupid. We can no longer focus for any significant time. Our minds flit from one thing to the next, never spending too much time thinking deeply about anything. We're distracted and we're constantly shifting and changing. And most of us have a hard time being quiet. There's so much noise. And whether it's noise out there or noise in here, it's hard to shut that down. When's the last time you spent a minute or two in just silence? When I get in my car, that would be a good time to be quiet, but I always have to have music on or something. There always has to be something going on. And so sometimes it's helpful to be quiet and to listen. Yes, if you have kids, it's a challenge. But it is possible for a minute or two to be silent, to find ways. It is a discipline, really. It has to be a discipline. And I think that's one of the reasons why. And I keep asking this question, what's God saying to you? It's hard for us to hear what God is saying. He doesn't always compete for our attention. So no wonder we have a hard time hearing from him. So earnestness and discipline are also, silence is hard, prayer is hard, discipline is hard. Someone wrote years ago, we're amusing ourselves to death with trivialities. So where is our single-minded devotion to Christ? I love David's words in the Psalm, in Psalm 27, verse 4, where he says, one thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him. One thing. So, this is the focus. This is the center of his life, he's saying, is one thing I want in life is to know, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord, to know him more deeply. That is the focus of my life. I think a lot of us just dabble in so many things. There's not one thing that we focus on ever. And so one of the things I think that we need to grow in is that ability to focus on God wholeheartedly. So I've been spending a lot of time reading and thinking about monastics, people who lived in monasteries, or still do actually, monks and nuns. Sorry, it's a weird thing to think about, I know. But it's part of a course, so that's why I'm doing it. But I actually have an attraction to that. There used to be people that went out into the desert just to dedicate themselves wholly to God. They called themselves athletes for God. That's that picture of when you're an athlete, you train yourself. You don't just arrive on the day of the competition without having trained at all. You train yourself for the competition. And so they saw themselves as athletes for God. They trained themselves in the disciplines of prayer and solitude and silence and meditation and reading the scriptures. And they had a rule of life as they gathered together, the ways that things operated as they lived together in community, the ways that they treated each other, the way there was a rhythm to their days and their weeks and their months and their years that shaped them as a people, with the goal always that they would be shaped into the image of God together. And they saw all of time as God's time, and it was meant to bring glory to God. We read that verse at the end of this passage, that all things would bring glory to him. And so they saw their hours and their minutes and their days and their weeks and their months and the years as God's time, belonging to him. And so they took that seriously, and they wanted to focus on him in those times. It didn't mean that actually monks actually worked hard. Benedictine monks would spend 4 hours in the morning in prayer, 4 hours in the evening in prayer, 6 hours working during the day. They had a long day. They worked hard. They worked in manual labor for the most part. And so they didn't just sit and pray. They were engaged in the community. And Peter says, be focused so you can pray. And the second thing that he commands us to do in this little letter is love one another earnestly. Or another translation says, show deep love for each other. And you notice that in this translation, Peter says, most important of all of these things is for you to love one another deeply. And so he says the word he uses in that passage is the Greek word agape, which you're probably familiar with. And it's God's love. It's that unconditional love. And so really the ultimate expression of that phrase where Peter says, he quotes the Old Testament, he says, love covers a multitude of sins. Love covers a multitude of sins. He says, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. Ultimately, Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection is what covers a multitude of sins. That's the clearest demonstration of God's love for us. And our love for each other is meant to be a reflection of that love, that kind of love. Now, it's pretty imperfect, right? We're all learning. Some people call them, when you ask themselves if you're Christian, they're saying, no, I'm not a practicing Christian. We're all we should be practicing this, right? Because it's a learning process. We're learning how to love one another. We do it very imperfectly, but this is what should characterize our lives together. It's a reflection, a poor reflection of Christ's love for us. And when we get close enough to each other, we're going to need that kind of love that covers a multitude of sins, because we're going to have to forgive one another, unless we're content with a kind of church that never gets close to anyone, right? Where we just kind of keep our distance. So we need to learn how to show in practical, tangible ways, the love of God for each other, in words, not just in words, but in actions. And that's one of the things that will make us a people who are distinctive, is that brotherly and sisterly love for one another. So if you're part of that kind of community, undoubtedly we're going to disappoint each other. We're going to hurt each other. We're not going to live up to expectations. I'm not going to, you're not going to. But love covers a multitude of sins, just like Christ's love covers a multitude of my sins and your sins. So what Peter's talking about is not just a casual cup of coffee and cookies after a worship gathering, right? Nothing wrong with that. I'm all in for that. It's much deeper than that. Love each other deeply. This will require us to get closer. You see how this is leading into why we need house churches, right? Number 3, the third command is be hospitable to one another without grumbling. So it's getting more, the more he talks, the more inconvenient this is getting. And I think some of us are just naturally hospitable. You have a gift of hospitality. This comes naturally for you. Others of us aren't. And it feels very inconvenient to a lot of us. And I think over the years we've lost the art of hospitality, if we ever had it. The last couple of years probably haven't helped that process. And so we may feel like, do we really have to, invite them into our homes? So I can hear the grumbling now because I've done it myself, right? Oh man, I invited them over. I'm not speaking about anybody in this room, I'm sure. But we invited them over and now I'm tired and do we really have to? It'd be so much easier to cancel. I'm always, glad that we do that when it happens, but I grumble. Maybe you do too. And so this is a very real thing without, open your homes to people, but without grumbling. So in Peter's context, it was probably there were people within those churches that had been rejected, maybe had lost their job, maybe had lost the connection with their family, so had lost their place to stay. And so very literally, you would have to invite them into your home. Somebody needed to care for them. There was no safety net. Someone needed to invite them into your home. There were people who traveled around like Paul and were itinerant missionaries, and so they would need a place to stay, and so you would extend hospitality to them and welcome them into your home. So there were those kinds of situations. But I think there's a case for all of us to begin to learn to practice hospitality with one another. And so I don't think that just putting on the coffee, as we're going to do today, and putting out a plate of cookies is enough. I think it needs to go deeper. I think there's something that happens when you have people into your home, that there's a dynamic there that you can't get in a space like this. And that's why we're encouraging our house churches to actually meet in homes. And so over the last number of months, we've gotten used to some of them meeting in this setting, but it really isn't the same. So you get to go into someone's home, and please don't feel like you have to be perfect, because you aren't perfect. So your house doesn't have to be perfect. So if the dishes aren't all done and it's not spotlessly clean, give yourself a break. And it's actually sometimes nice because everybody else feels like, this is more natural. My house doesn't look perfect all the time. You should see my office right now. It's awful. I can hardly stand being in there right now. It's so cluttered. There's papers and books everywhere. But this is the real me, right? So I'll show you my office if you really want to see it, because that's what it is. That's the reality. So let's not pretend that we are something. It takes a lot of the stress off of us if we don't have to be perfect when we open our homes to others. So isn't it interesting how often in the Gospels Jesus is in homes, often around a table, or in the book of Acts, the rhythm that they had established, which was early on anyway, before persecution scattered them, house to house. They met daily, house to house, and in the temple courts. So there was this rhythm that they had, somewhat similar to what we have, although we're not meeting daily. But there was this sense of joy and fellowship that was deep. It wasn't shallow. That's number 3. So open your homes to each other. Extend hospitality. Number 4 is each of you should use whatever gift you have to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. There's a lot that we could talk about here. The first, I guess we could just say it's each of you. It's not just a few of you. It's not just certain ones, but it's each of you has a gift from God that you are a steward of, that you are meant to serve others with. Each of you. So if you're a leader, that doesn't mean that you have to do everything. That's, I think, been the downfall that we've had sometimes, is that people will lead, they'll take on a ministry, and it's like a life sentence. It's like they're doing it forever. And no one wants to step in, because some of them do it really well. And so, but we need to share that role. We need to allow people to try different things and to discover their gifts and learn from experience and to practice. Even if it's going to be messy at times when people try to use their gifts and they're not really developed in them. It may not be a flashy one, it may not be an upfront one, but whatever God has given to you as a gift from him, we need. The body needs, the church needs. It's going to be far from perfect. We'll make mistakes. But one of the things for those of you who are perfectionists is we need to live with imperfection. This world is not perfect. You're not perfect. So you need to learn to live with imperfection. You do the best you can in the power, trusting in God's Spirit, but we need to live with imperfection. And that's where grace and love comes in, and we receive those gifts from one another. So I try to use my language intentionally. So I have been using the words worship gathering for months now. I do that for a reason. It's not just haphazard. Sometimes the word worship service pops out of my mouth because I've been trained that way for years and years. But I call it a worship gathering because it's a gathering of God's people in different sizes, different kinds of group for the worship of God. Sometimes this worship service can have a connotation of, I come to this place for a service. I go to Walmart after for a service. I go to the gas station for some service. It's like I'm a passive receiver rather than a participant. So worship gathering is a place where we come together and we use our gifts. We serve one another. We're not consumers of religious goods and services. That's not the church. And so, but as participative as we would like this kind of a gathering to be, there are restrictions and limitations in it. And so that is where we need house church gatherings, that's the place where hopefully every single person in that house church has an opportunity to use their gifts and to be encouraged in that and equipped in that. Sometimes people have compared the churches that put all of their emphasis on what we do on a Sunday morning to a bird with one wing. So if you've seen a bird that has a broken wing, it's not pretty. It's a difficult thing to watch. They can't fly. Sometimes they're just kind of spinning around in one spot. They're not getting anywhere because one wing is useless. The other one they can use. And sometimes the church over the years has been like that. It's like a bird with one wing. We've got one wing. We do okay with sort of this kind of a gathering. But the other wing is broken, non-existent, or just not being used to its full impact. And so we want to be a church with two wings that has that kind of a strength, with strength in this kind of a gathering, whole church gathering, and strength in house church gatherings. But to make that happen, we're going to all have to use the gifts that God has given us to serve one another, because those gifts are given by Him. They're not ours. They don't bring the focus on ourselves. They're not meant to do that. They're meant to be service to one another. And as a gift, it reflects the generosity of God. God is a gift-giving God. He generously gives to us, and we generously share those things with others. You probably could, I don't know why Peter didn't, but he could probably have put without grumbling on this verse too. Because we do that one too, right? Use your gifts generously to serve others without grumbling. I'm guilty of that on occasion too. So, to be faithful servants, it needs God's grace. And the goal of all of that, those four things, as we live our life together as a gospel-shaped community, is that in everything God will be given glory. We don't glorify one person. We don't glorify the preacher or the worship leader or the kids' own director. We don't glorify ourselves. We want all glory to be given to God. So Peter writes these things to a church under pressure. Pressure from within, pressure from without. I think as a house church, if you're part of a house church, you could take these four things and make the beginnings of a monastic rule of life for your house church. You could do that. You may not like the word rule, but rule in Greek in originally meant, it's the same word that's used for trellis. You know what a trellis that you put a vine on, the vine grows up the trellis. The trellis isn't a burden like we think of laws and rules being. The trellis actually supports the growth of the plant. So if you didn't have the trellis for some plants, it wouldn't grow properly. It would be on the ground. And so the rule of life for a community is something that supports the group of the people, the life and the growth of the people in that group. So your house church needs a rule, a trellis, something to support its growth. So you could use these four. There's probably more that you could use. You could. We want to be a house church that prays earnestly. We want to be a house church that loves deeply. We want to be a house church that opens our homes cheerfully. We want to be a house church that shares God's gifts generously. That's just a real basic outline of a rule. You would flesh that out. But there's other things that I would put in there too. But you see how that works together? You know, it's simple in a lot of ways. Not easy, but it's simple. And in all things, may glory and power be to God forever and ever.